Buenos dias, everyone. My Spanish basically ends there, so I have no idea how I was just introduced. I assume it was all good. Good morning, I'm Kate Glazebrook. I'm from the Behavioural Insights Team, and it's a true pleasure to be here with you all this morning. When we were chatting with the organising team a few months back and we were hearing about the pretty intense sort of selection criteria you all had to go through, it was very exciting to be part of the room. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things this morning, and I apologise in advance that it might go quite quickly. There are quite a few things I wanted to chat to you about, but I'll be around all day, so if you wanted to talk to me, please feel free to come up. I'll also try and leave a fair bit of time for questions. So what are we going to cover this morning? First of all, an incredibly brief history of the evolution of behavioural science. I'm not going to pretend that that's going to be comprehensive. Then I wanted to spend more time on why we should run experiments. I know that this has been a theme of yesterday and it will continue to be a theme for today, but from our perspective at the Behavioural Insights Team, I wanted to give you a perspective on how we've approached experimentation in government. Our approach in practice, which kind of takes you a little bit through how we approach a particular behavioural insights project using the experimental lens. Some key lessons. So I wanted to also bring out some of the things that we've learnt in the 5 years that we've been about in the UK. It's possible that some of those lessons will be useful to you in your endeavours to bring sort of impact evaluation to the centre of what your organisations do. And then finally, some time for questions. But I wouldn't be from the Behavioural Insights Team unless I was going to run an experiment on you. So very quickly, to get the neurons firing, because I know you've all had a fun time at the cocktail evening last night, I'm going to put a little memory test to you. So I'm going to show you a series of photos, and I just want you to pay attention to the photos that I put up on the screen. It's deliberately fast. Now it's your turn. You have pieces of paper and a pen. There were 14 images that I just showed you. Try and write down the ones that you can remember. See some scratching of heads, some stalling. Okay. Now that you've had a bit of time to write them down, I ask you, in fairness to yourself, I'm now going to test you on which ones you really remember. So, how did you do? Can you put your hand up if you remember both of these two, not just one, but both? Okay. Got about, the front row's really paying attention here. Okay, well done. This wasn't a test for them. Okay, great. We've got about sort of 15% of you. What about Apple and policeman? Oh yeah, okay, about 60%, 70%. Nice. How about the music and the washing machine? 20-odd%. Okay. And finally, what about the clock and the dog? Few more, 30-odd%. Okay. By my guess, we had more people remember the apple and policeman and the clock and the dog, just by a margin. Yeah? Okay. So what distinguishes these pairs? Can anyone guess? Any ideas? Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. They were the first two and the last two that I showed you. So this is a very, very rough experiment, which I'm pleased worked broadly well in this audience, usually does, to show that how your memory works is not perfectly linear. Just to say you remembered the first few things I showed you because your mind was active. I'd just given you a task and you were paying attention to it. And then you kind of the pictures roll through and it becomes a little bit harder, and all of a sudden you're seeing cows and you're seeing all kinds of random objects, and then toward the end you remember the ones that were more recent in your brain. And this reflects two behavioural biases, which we call recency and primacy biases. And if you kind of think about time and you think about your attentiveness or your ability to retain information, broadly we find that these two things hold. Now, I could have done this just to be a bit cruel when it's sort of first thing in the morning, but more importantly, I did this to show that we are all the same. We are all subject to the behavioural biases that we see in the literature, and it's important to keep that level of humility in the way that we work. This certainly worked on us in the team, as does a lot of the other experiments that we put in our presentations. It's also an opportunity to show you that the behavioural science is quite widespread. So we now have quite a broad literature that we're drawing on in the Behavioural Insights team, as do other teams that bring in the behavioural sciences into policy making. And it's an opportunity to think about, well, what does recency and primacy bias mean for the way that we design policy? We've used these kinds of techniques for government communications. So if you're sending out a letter to people and you want them to pay attention to particular details, but you might also need to tell them a bunch of boring legalistic language, think about where you put things. Put things at the beginning and put things at the end. They're the things that most people will tend to remember. But here's a very quick evolution of the behavioural sciences. It's probably fair to say that there are three broad chunks to how the behavioural sciences have evolved over time. It sort of started from what we might kind of call deep physiological responses. So I'm going to show you an image here. Has anyone ever seen this image before? No? Okay, so some brave person. Can someone tell me whether they think the square A or square B is darker in colour? A? A is darker? Yeah? Seems pretty obvious, right? What if I remove some distractions for you? I did not play with this image, I promise you, except to blank out those other squares. So what's happening here? What we're seeing here is that your brain and your eyes working together have kind of fabricated that there's something going on. There's a shadow being created by the green column, and your brain is making adjustments for that. But it's an important opportunity to remember that sometimes our brains trick us, much as I played the little trick on you with your memory. We also see this happening even in the physiology of how we see items. So this was an example of some of the very, very early things that were happening in the behavioural sciences that showed that our kind of neurological responses are context specific. We then moved on to sort of social experiments. So through the middle of last century, many of you will probably have heard of the Milgram experiments, which is sort of testing the extent to which we understand human behaviour as being hugely about the sort of social environment in which it takes place. Here is an experiment by Solomon Asch, who is a very famous psychologist. And I'm going to ask you again, looking at this left line here, can someone tell me which line on the right-hand side it looks most like? A? Yeah? That seems really obvious, right? Now you don't trust me, right? You're thinking I'm going to do something bad to you. So you were absolutely right. They are exactly the same length. But what Solomon Asch's experiment showed is that when you put people in a room and you get them to make estimates in front of other people, you can very much change what they might see as being obvious. So this particular experiment had 8 people in a room, and they asked them a perception task. So they asked them examples of versions like this. So in front of a group of people, tell me which one you think it is most like. What they didn't realise is that there was actually only one participant out of the 8. The other 7 were Confederates, so they were part of the experiment themselves. And the experiment had up to 15 different types of tests like this, and the other 7 people were there to say the wrong answer and to test whether or not there was social conformity by that one participant. So when I ask you which is it most like, and everyone else in the room, everyone around you says, oh, it's very like B, you're sitting there and you're thinking, no, surely it's not. What his experiment showed is about 1/3 of the time people conform to what other people around them are telling them, even on a very obvious task like this. Now, interestingly, this experiment shows that about 5% of people are completely immune to the sort of social conformity bias, but that 75% of people at some point in this experiment, not all the time, but at some point, conform to what other people are doing. So these were kind of middle of the century experiments showing that we're very, very much influenced by our social environments. And that obviously has implications for all kinds of things, and Milgram experiment was much more on sort of authority and how we understand what we'd be willing to do to other people. But finally, we've now moved on to sort of slightly more sophisticated understandings of how our context affects our decision making. So if I said to you that this is a graph, it's a real graph, showing the rate at which a judge pardons or gives bail to someone coming into them. So this starts at about 65% of the time they give bail, and then it reduces over some metric. And then increases again and reduces over some metric. Can someone tell me what they think this bottom axis represents? Yeah? Brilliant. That's exactly what it shows. So this is a real experiment showing data from Israel on, this is basically when they have lunch and when they have a break. So what does this tell you is if you're going to be in an Israeli court, you don't want to be caught being seen by the judge here, because your likelihood of being pardoned is much, much, much lower, statistically speaking about 10% vis-a-vis 65%. This is sort of a terrifying statistic that has kind of informed a whole bunch of thinking around even something as hard as legal decisions can be subject to whether or not the person seeing you is hungry. And why is that? There's been a lot of research more recently into what they call executive function or sort of cognitive load. So basically your brain gets tired, and as your brain gets tired and you lowering glucose levels, your kind of approaches to risk change. It's less risky to put someone on bail than it is to not. So as I get kind of closer to the point at which I'm overloaded, I've had to make lots of decisions, and importantly, it's important to know that Israeli judges make lots and lots of decisions. They see many more cases than a lot of other jurisdictions do, that your kind of tendency to want to take a risk and give bail lowers. So what the writer of this experiment said is, our findings suggest that judicial rulings can be swayed by extraneous variables that should have no bearing on legal decisions. So these are just sort of three examples of sort of the evolution of behavioural science, but many of you will possibly have heard of System 1 and System 2, which has been a kind of a concept purported by Danny Kahneman, who's the first non-economist to win a Nobel Prize in economics. He's a famous psychologist, and he's basically done a lot of work to kind of bring together the field and think about what behavioural science might mean in an economic context. He kind of popularised this notion that we have two systems operating in our brains simultaneously. System 1 is your sort of fast thinking, your automatic, your almost intuitive responses. It's the part of your brain that makes it easy for you to go on your daily commute. It's the part of your brain that knows where to look when you hear a sound. It's much more deliberative, and it takes a lot more energy, both sort of cognitive energy, but even glucose energy. And that's the part of your brain that's used for analytical tasks, like, you know, planning a trip overseas where you have to make sure that your bookings all match up and you're arriving in that country at the right time and on the right day and so forth. And what Danny's sort of popularised is it's often misconstrued that your System 1 is bad and your System 2 is good. His argument is no, that's not the case at all. It's actually the case that your System 1 is the thing that keeps us alive most of the time. The issue is when things get put in the wrong category. So when we're making decisions with our System 1 brain, which actually probably should be made by our System 2. And so those of us in the Behavioural Insights team spend a lot of time thinking about, are people making decisions with the right parts of their brains, and how do we shift things from one to the other? So if we're thinking about encouraging people to save more for the future, are they making it currently with a sort of an effortless side, which is that today I don't feel like I have any extra cash to put aside, when in actual fact we should be pushing it into System 2? Or should we be making certain things easier, like saving for the future should be made easier by changing the default, and that's actually pushing it back into System 1, which is that if you make no decision, the right kind of outcome ensues. So what have we done in the Behavioural Insights team? We tried a little while ago to create a document that kind of compiled all of these behavioural insights, and it was called Mindspace. It was a mnemonic that sort of stood for messenger effects, incentives, norms, and so forth. But we quickly found that we hadn't applied enough behavioural science to our own work. 9 letters was too long for people to remember, and even though we'd made it as accessible for public policy makers as we could, we thought there was a way of simplifying further. So we've more recently come up with a new framework, which we call EAST, which is deliberately designed for people like yourselves. If you wanted to think about the role that behavioural science might play in the way that you design policy, we're hoping that this document is the sort of thing for you. And I'll quickly run through what that looks like. So what does it mean to make things easy? Here is just a very quick list of the sorts of things we put in there. Thinking about the ordering, so we talked about the memory task. Thinking about what friction costs are, so we know that people are disproportionately likely to not do something the more steps you put into a process, however much they may want that final outcome. So thinking about friction is very important. And as I said, thinking about the default. What about making it attractive? This is where we think about attracting attention. So in many cases, this is the area where people say, isn't this just marketing or advertising? And in some respects, it's very much the same kinds of concepts that we would use. What is the most salient thing on a piece of paper, and is it the thing that you want it to be? Thinking about personalization, so we've run a lot of trials where we test different ways of using your exact name. So Dear Armando is more effective than saying Dear Colleague, for example. And then also thinking about how does behavioural science help you to think differently about rewards and incentives. So that may well be bringing in that we know that lotteries are a particularly effective way of getting people to sign up to something, largely because we disproportionately believe that small probabilities are more likely to happen than they are. What about social? So this is where we kind of come back to some of this work that I talked about in the middle of last century around social norms. But it's also where we think about social commitment. So if I make a commitment to a friend that I'm going to go to the gym twice a week, and more importantly, if my friend knows that I don't go to the gym twice a week, that's going to be a much more powerful motivator for me than simply making a decision at the beginning of the week that I never write down or I never feel I've made a commitment to. And then finally, thinking about reciprocity, and we've done some interesting trials around just the power of someone having done something small for you and the likelihood that you would then do something back in return. So that we've applied a lot of these concepts, for example, to charitable giving. And then finally, thinking about making whatever you do timely. And this is an area where we really feel that policymakers tend not to have thought about the impact of their decisions. So have you thought about when you roll out a program whether it falls at a particular time of the year where people are more or less likely to act? So if you're asking people to save for the future, we know that disproportionately you'll get different responses if you ask them in December than if you ask them in January. Now, it seems intuitive when you say out loud, well, of course, people in December are saving for Christmas presents and they've got other holiday plans that they might be saving for. But it's crazy to think that we would roll out programs without thinking about when we're asking people to do things. This is also where we bring in concepts like present bias, our disproportionate focus on what's happening in the here and now vis-a-vis what's happening in the future. And where we also break things down into how do we get people to commit through implementation intentions. Now, in our recent report, we kind of cover a whole bunch of trials under all of these areas that give you some examples of how we've used these in public policy areas everywhere from health to education to crime to corruption and so forth. So I encourage you, if you're at all interested, to have a look into that. But today's talk is much more on why we want to run experiments. So I thought I'd go through two key reasons why we run experiments. And I know that yesterday the talk by David talked about a very important third reason as well. But very quickly, I wanted to quickly run through the first one, which is that by not testing, it can be dangerous. So yesterday, David talked about the Scared Straight program, a very important example of where we've gotten it wrong. And I wanted to tell you about another one, which is about steroids for head injury. Have we got any doctors in the room? No? Great. There's a nurse. Okay. Well, you can correct me if you feel this is any different. But for many years, when you went into accident and emergency worldwide, and you had a head injury, the first thing that the medical response would do would be to inject you with steroids. Now that seemed like a very, very sensible approach. Steroids, we know, reduce inflammation, and it was widely believed that inflammation of the brain on the cranium is what caused a greater chance of brain injury and kind of long-term disability. Now the problem was, despite the fact this is being used worldwide and used quite often, because a lot of people end up in accident and emergency for head injury, there had been no randomized control trial to prove that that was the right first medical response. Now, as yesterday was discussed, randomized control trials have been long used in the medical sciences, and it's actually more recent that we've tried to bring them into a public policy context. So a bunch of sort of well-meaning doctors decided that they thought it might be important to run a randomized control trial. It took them between 5 and 10 years to get ethics approval to do this, for the very reason that people thought, much like jumping out of a plane, why would I test something I know works? And many doctors felt that this worked. Eventually, they did get up a randomized control trial, in fact, over multiple countries, and there were about 10,000 people in this randomized control trial. They were either given steroids or not given steroids when they came in with a head injury. Now, what this particular experiment showed is that the randomized control trial was stopped early. It was stopped early because it had become apparent that it was unethical to be giving people steroids when we knew with statistical validity that we were in fact more likely to be killing people and leading to long-term disability by giving them steroids than by not. Now, this was an important example of a time where real lives were being saved from having tested what was anti-intuitive to many doctors. So you'll be happy to know that if you go into accident emergency, they won't be first giving you steroids. The other reason is because sometimes intuitions fail us, and even us experts. And I wanted to give you a very quick example of an experiment which we ran early in the team on prompting organ donation. So in the UK, there was a problem that we don't have enough people on our organ registry. And so one of the opportunities that we had was while people were updating their taxes, why not just ask them at the end of that process? We talked about being timely. While you already have thousands, in fact millions of people engaging in an online process to update their tax, why not just tack an extra question on there? So ahead of time, we had an opportunity. We had a huge sample size, so we could test a lot of different potential messages. And we tested 8. So in fact, we tested a control group where it just said, thank you, please join the register. We tested one which sort of tapped into social norms. So every day, thousands of people who see this page decide to register. We then tried this norm message with a picture of people who looked happy about potentially getting an organ. The same message, but with the logo of the registry, which we thought had kind of wide social appeal. Then we tested a sort of loss-based image. So every day, 3 people die because we don't have enough organs. What about the reverse? So thinking about the potential number of people who have been saved, 9 lives could be saved. This reciprocity image. And one on if you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. So drawing attention to the fact that a lot of people say they want to be organ donors, but sort of fail to follow through. So here's your opportunity to follow through on what many of you already say that you want to do. So we tested all of these, and this is what we found. So with the control group, about 2.5% of people became registrants. If you added one of the take action, so this is the follow through one, you got a significant increase. And this is kind of how we found the results panned out. So these are all statistically significantly better than the control, which is good. But one of them did worse. And not only worse, but actually statistically significantly worse. Now, what's important about this last one here is before we ran the trial, we asked leading behavioural scientists which one they thought would be most effective. And they said that one. So what's also important to note here is that when you also convert that into not only did they click through, but did they in fact become registrants, you start to see even slightly different ones performed best. So this is sort of to show 2 things. One is that when you ask experts, sometimes we get it wrong, including us. And 2, it's important to make sure what you're measuring is the final thing that you truly care about, which is that people actually become registrants, not just points along the process. Now, we often spend time trying to capture information all the way along, but make sure that you always capture the final outcome that you care about. Now, this is important because once we've rolled this out, about 96,000 additional people have become organ donors, and it was a relatively cheap and easy trial to set up. So what's our approach in practice? I mentioned that the Behavioural Insights team being who we are, we basically spend a lot of our time converting what we do into mnemonics, into easy things we can try to remember. So we've got another methodology which you might find of interest, which is TEST. So every project that we do has 4 key components. The first is we spend a lot of time on targeting the problem, making sure we truly understand what is the problem that you are trying to solve here. So in the organ registry, it wasn't how many people can we get to click through to become registrants, it's how many people can we actually get to register. Then we spend a very long time in what we call the explore phase, and this is where we kind of bring in anthropology, sociology, and the other kind of aspects of social science that help us to understand the context from the ground up. Then we get to the solutioning phase, which is what I'm sure a lot of you spend a lot of your time on, and that's where we bring in our EAST framework as well as other work to design different types of interventions. And then we test and trial them. So I'll give you a very quick run through of what that looks like. So in the target phase, we see a lot of these kinds of objectives in government policy. I'm sure some of you do as well. So let's say the objective is to improve the growth of small businesses. Now that's a laudable aim. But we spend time talking about the fact that this is actually a very generic and very hard to measure ultimate objectives. So what are we trying to improve here? What exactly is improvement in this context? what is growth? What exactly are we trying to grow? Are we trying to grow turnover? Are we trying to grow the number of people who have jobs in small businesses? And what is a small business here? What's the definition of a small business? So we spend a lot of time with government agencies, probably to their chagrin, to spend time saying, how do we break this out into something that's very, very specific that we can test? So I'm sure many of you have heard of from the middle of central governments. And our approach in the Behavioural Insights team is about taking that, sort of flipping that approach on its head and spending time out there in the field with the real people delivering the policies that you aim to change. I'm sure many of you spend your time doing that. I know that it was a sort of big change in the way that I approached policy making. But this is an example of a time when we went out with real court bailiffs to test whether or not we could get more people to pay their fines on time. And by going out there with the actual person who knocks on the doors and says, how come you haven't paid your court fine, you actually learn a lot of interesting details, which include that the best way that we had been communicating with people was via letters. And we discovered by looking in the hallways that there were stacks of unopened mail in the hallways of the people we were trying to change. So we quickly discovered that sending better letters was not going to be the best way of getting behaviour change here, and we moved to a text messaging system as a result. Now, the solution phase I'm not going to spend very long on because we talked about the EAST framework, but just simply to say that common sources of solutions are sort of expert hunches, and we talked about how sometimes they fail you. You can transplant from elsewhere, but it's important to make sure you understand the context. The views of opinion leaders can be great, but as we talked about yesterday, the value of science is kind of pairing that with as much evidence as you possibly can. And our approach is that good ideas can come from anywhere. So our bailiff work came from actually standing there with someone who's actually a bailiff, and they said, well, you know what, maybe we should send them a text message. Oh, that's a great idea. Why don't we test that? And that we have some methodologies that we use, which you'd be welcome to pick up. They're all publicly available. And finally, we try to trial things. So since we started in 2010, we've run over 200 randomized control trials across pretty much every area of public policy in the UK. And we're now increasingly working with foreign governments, including Mexican government, on trialing things. I won't spend long on this, but these are the phases we typically go through in our trial and randomization, but these are all covered under our test, learn, and adapt framework, which is also publicly available. So some of you might be thinking, that's all well and good, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to get this done in my own context. So I wanted to spend a tiny bit on common skeptical responses to using randomized control trials. So one, isn't that what experts are for? And I think we kind of have touched on the fact that we don't always necessarily know what works. That they're too expensive. Many of our trials have actually brought in money, so we've done a lot of work with tax agencies on different ways of getting people to pay their tax on time. So not only is it a cheap and easy intervention by changing a letter, and oftentimes, you actually bring in back money to the government that they can then spend more efficiently. And it's important to also say, what are we comparing to? So rolling out a program nationwide when you don't know if it works is hugely expensive. It just so happens we don't at the moment have metrics for knowing how expensive that has been. But I think, as I'll try and touch on shortly, it's about reframing what we understand risk to be from a decision maker's perspective. That they're time consuming. So that may well be true. And sometimes it is worth thinking about what we can really do about quick and easy wins that give decision makers a response that they feel that they need in order to give you the time to do the kind of in-depth evaluative work that you need to do. That they're unethical. So in medical research, we've been using these approaches for donkey's years. So why do we think differently about policy responses? Why should we think differently about doing labour market interventions than we would do medical interventions when we know that there's huge amounts of money that go into those programs, but also where we think that the flow-on impacts in terms of welfare are as important to people? We should take care, and we do also have ethical procedures, as I'm sure many of you do. And finally, my decision makers won't go for it. And I want to quickly spend a little time on this, as I know that's probably what you're thinking mostly about. And I'm running out short of time, so I'll be very quick. I wanted to say that it wasn't always easy and wasn't always rosy for us. So this is a very, very short snapshot of the kinds of media we were getting in 2010 when we first started. A lot of people were very anxious about government manipulation and experimentation. But in just 5 short years, we've now seen that 2/3 of the MPs in the UK think we should be using more randomized control trials. So the kind of growth and kind of knowledge gap, I suppose, has been closed very, very quickly, at least in the UK context. So how have we done that? I wanted to just say that I think it's important, as always, to think about the fact that we're all human and that you'll be dealing with people across the policy spectrum that exist in a media landscape that you can't always control. So having a think about what are the motivations of each of these actors, so the public, the politicians and your decision makers, the policy makers, you yourselves, and some of your colleagues, and also frontline staff. And thinking about what motivates them and the kinds of things that they might fear, and how that leads you to thinking about the way you would run a randomized control trial or run an evaluation with them that addresses their own circumstances. So in the case of the public and politicians, they're worried about, I've made election promises, I said that I would do this. They're also worried about saying no to people. So how do you frame using an evaluative technique that is more effective? Thinking about policymakers, so there's a pressure to deliver now, and you have a need to have frank and fearless debate. So what happens if your evaluation shows that a very popular program isn't going to work? So you need to think ahead of time about ways of prepping the right kinds of responses, testing different types of things, and also having an eye to the fact that that's going to be a tough conversation to have. So very quickly, also frontline staff and the public, they don't want to be saying no. So if you've got a medical intervention that says, sorry, I can't give you this right now, that's a tough conversation to have. How do you prep them for those conversations? And finally, is there an empathy gap here? Much like I did, do we all know and do we understand the context of the frontline staff whose jobs we would be changing through our evaluation? So I might just finish on this final slide and just say these are the 4 things I think might be worthwhile keeping in mind. One is that you need to think about reframing risk from the perspective of the people that you're going to work with. So talking to them about the fact that more knowledge will lead them to making better decisions. And then also thinking about the cost savings that you might be able to deliver a minister in their own portfolio that they can spend in other areas. Building a culture of experimentation has been hugely important for us, and using the experience of CAF and others who do a lot of this work to kind of prep people on that you wouldn't be the first one to do this, and here's some examples of how it's worked elsewhere. Human-centered design. So we use a lot of design thinking techniques as well, and we've found that this could be a very, very, it's a growing area. I'm sure some of you have come across it in your own work, but that's led us to thinking very differently about policy responses that are more effective. And then also thinking about your public mandate and transparency. So none of this we could do were it not that we had the support of key political leaders and key policy officials. And wherever possible, publishing all of your results. As much as possible, publishing when things don't work, as much as when they do. So I know I've run over a little bit over time, my apologies, and thank you very much.